You now appear on the Tucker Carlson show regularly. So you're on the highest rated show on the biggest cable news network on the planet. And you regularly inveigh against corporate media, including places that you've worked, like places kind of like Salon or The Guardian, or places that you started, like The Intercept, as corporate media and as shills and all of this. What the fuck happened? Have you changed or has the world changed?
I think it's mostly the latter. If you go
Mhm.
back, though, and look at even my earliest writings,
Yeah.
I began with a very narrow range of aspirations about what I wanted to write about. It was
Mhm.
mostly these legalistic and constitutional debates about Article 2 theories of executive power promulgated by
And this
George Bush
was
and Dick Cheney.
pre-Salon. It was like you were
Yeah, it was
on
like July
Blogger or whatever.
2005.
Yeah,
I,
yeah.
just hit start blog on
Right.
that Google free blogspot platform, mostly to talk about this very narrow range of issues from the perspective of a civil libertarian, and quickly realized there was no way to have an impact without
Mhm.
also confronting political dynamics and especially
Mhm.
journalistic ones, because you were running into a wall of deceit and misinformation promulgated by the corporate media about the war on
Mhm.
terror and what was being done. So I've been inveighing against the kind of systemic problems in corporate media almost from the beginning. That's
Mhm.
nothing new. I would go on CNN and MSNBC and would do the same thing about those networks, about other networks.
Mhm.
I think one of the main reasons Edward Snowden has said that he was drawn to me wasn't so much because of my views about privacy and surveillance,
Mhm.
although those aligned with his, but he saw that I looked at journalism in a radically different way than
Mhm.
most of the media. He was concerned that if they went to them, they would cooperate more with the government than I would. They'd be more
Mhm.
persuadable not to publish things than I would. So I've always had a very prominent component of my work being media criticism.
Mhm.
Obviously, appearing more on Fox than MSNBC and CNN is something that's new. But I think that's because the views that I've always espoused, the kind of values I've always embraced, are heard more on Fox and than CNN and MSNBC, where they're not welcome.
That is kind of amazing, though, right? Because 15 years ago, Fox News was the national security network, and CNN was a critic, or MSNBC in particular. What what has changed that? Is it simply the fact of before and after Donald Trump, or that Republicans are out of power, so, or partly out of power, so they want to attack the government, and liberals or progressives are in power, so they want to protect the government?
I actually think the primary impetus originally was the reliance on Russiagate as
Hmm.
the principal theme of the Hillary Clinton campaign. Once you start positing that there's some evil foreign villain bent upon wreaking havoc inside the United States and that the political opponent domestically is aligned with that
Hmm.
foreign power, that's already kind of very jingoistic way of looking at the
Hmm.
world. You stimulate fear of and hatred toward a foreign enemy, and suddenly you want to be protected from that foreign
Yeah.
enemy. On top of which, Russiagate itself emanated from the bowels of the CIA, the
Hmm.
bowels of the US security state, which was feeding leaks to the Washington Post and the New York Times.
Hmm.
And liberals began viewing those security state agencies, the hatred of which has always been fundamental to left wing politics for decades, as not just their allies, but these kind of guardians of
Yeah.
all that was good and decent in the world. And that began this radical transformation about these kinds of questions. I think, one of the things that the left and right has in common is an awareness that our government is essentially been co-opted by corporate power. The richer you are, the more powerful you are within the corporate world, the
Mhm.
more power you exert in Washington, which isn't how a democracy should function. It's how a democracy does function.
Mhm.
And that means in general that there aren't radical divisions between, say, health insurance companies or Wall Street investment
Mhm.
firms and hedge funds on the one hand, and say General Dynamics and
Mhm.
Raytheon and Booz Allen on the other, the kind of
Yeah.
espionage and military contractors. It's a very united ideology. It's the ruling
Mhm.
class ideology. They fund both parties with equal vigor, some more than
Mhm.
one more than other, depending on the circumstances. But in general, they wield a lot of influence within both parties. I think that ideology prevails regardless of the outcome of
Mhm.
elections. And so I think absolutely there's a union between state power on the one hand and corporate power on
Mhm.
the other. You see that, for example, with how big tech censors. They don't censor in a way that undercuts or subverts Washington policy. They do
Mhm.
it in a way that promotes it. They're
Right.
censoring now anyone questioning the US and NATO war aims in Ukraine. That's not a coincidence. And so ironically, Democrats are very obsessed with finding fascism under every rock. If you look at the academic definition, one of the primary prongs, one of the most menacing, is the merger of state and corporate power, which I think does lie at the heart of the establishment liberal project in the United States. If you look at what is the predominant media narrative about the Republican Party in the age of Trump, it's essentially that the Republican Party has become a political faction steeped in an overarching ideology of white supremacy, and that its principal project is installing a white nationalist authoritarian regime or dictatorship. At the same time that you have this almost as a religious conviction on the part of journalists and people in Washington, you have an enormous stream of non-white voters going from either apathy or captivity to the Democratic Party into Republican Party politics. More Latinos voting for Republicans than ever before, Black voters and Asian voters and Muslim voters voting for Trump than any other prior Republican candidate in decades. And so I think you see this, it's like almost two different, completely different worlds, two completely different realities of what elite culture teaches you to think and what people are actually seem to be embracing. When you deindustrialize entire towns by the millions and ship jobs overseas and take away from people would have been the generational aspiration that they were going to have better lives than their parents, that entire American dream, and you leave them in these broken towns filled with addiction and filled with joblessness and working 3 shitty jobs with no benefits at Walmart and Amazon warehouse, and you leave people with the idea that their future holds nothing of greater value than themselves. They have that I think is what lies at the heart of spirituality. There is a connection between economic reality and people's spiritual well-being. If you look at the kinds of people who are tolerated and the kinds of people who are demonized widely, I think in that question is a very interesting revelation. It's the people who are demonized are obviously the people that sort of the system, for lack of a better term, regards as threatening. When is the last time you heard anyone really complaining about, let's say, Sean Hannity? Like almost never. He performs his role.
I actually forgotten that he existed.
Exactly, because no one talks about him. It's not because no one's watching his show. He says this. He's number 4 or 5. Numbers, he makes a ton of money on talk radio. He's a big audience, but he's very unthreatening because he's just like a partisan. He's a Republican Party loyalist. You know what he's going to say. He's out there preaching the same, established. Whatever comes out of Mitch McConnell's mouth comes out of Sean Hannity's mouth. There's no division. Whereas Tucker Carlson, to a lesser extent, Laura Ingraham, are people who are widely despised because they're actually doing something a little bit more subversive. As you said, they're questioning.
But they're also big. I mean, Tucker Carlson right now is, he's the Edward Murrow of his day, right?
People who are dissidents to establishment orthodoxy for good or for bad are the people who become the most threatening and therefore the most attacked and the most demonized.
So I guess let's talk about Tucker a little bit because he's big.
I think the strategy is to isolate him as this grave threat that we cannot tolerate. I don't know if you remember, but Glenn Beck had a bigger audience at 5 o'clock hour, which is not a very,
it's not a great
popular hour for television, than Tucker had. I mean, he was breaking insane amounts of records, and at the peak of his popularity, he was off Fox News because he had become so radioactive to establishment prerogatives that no advertiser was willing to touch him, and Fox got rid of him, even though he was bringing in many millions of people. So I think there's a line that you can't cross no matter how large your audience size is, and I think Tucker is flirting with that line, and you saw the kind of attempt to basically start to say that he is too dangerous to allow on air.
I wouldn't say it's too dangerous to allow on air, but I did a video about it. I mean, he does believe in the great replacement theory.
What does that mean to you?
You know what it means is that he believes that America is being, white America, which is America, is being overtaken by ethnics of various sorts, and we need to stop that.
I think what it means is something different, which is, if you look at Democratic Party strategists, as I'm sure you know, for decades, their promise for Democratic Party dominance eternally was going to be that immigration was going to change the face of the United States demographically, make it more liberal, make it more left, and that the Republicans would therefore no longer have a chance. So when we know what it reminds me of so much is, I remember in the kind of the mid 2000s when I started writing about politics, you would often see in the Weekly Standard and other neocon outlets articles that would say, American Jews are immoral if they vote for the Democratic Party because the Republican Party is more pro-Israel. The obvious assumption of that argument is that American Jews cast their votes not based on what's
Right.
best for the United States, but what's based on
Right.
for a foreign country, which is Israel.
Right.
If you say that kind of speaking as a Jew, urging Jews to vote
Right.
Republican, it becomes completely permissible.
Yeah.
If you observe, however, that is actually taking place from the perspective
Right.
of critiquing it, you will be instantly vilified as an anti-Semite, even though you're embracing exactly the same theory,
Right.
albeit for a different purpose. That, I think, is what is the
Yeah.
great replacement theory when pinned
Well,
to Tucker. I don't
but
agree.
Tucker,
I don't agree that his argument is that the only real citizens of the United States are white Americans. He's never hinted at that.
Well, he wants to, stop immigration. He believes that ethnic people end up voting,
Foreign people.
However, well, also that there are massive numbers of foreign people who are coming here and immediately voting, which doesn't happen, but that he essentializes them. That if you're a Latino, you're always going to vote this way. If you're this, you're always going to vote that way.
But I think he's pointing out that that's the Democratic Party plan because they say it is.
Yep,
but ironically,
also,
you have these huge numbers of Latinos who are actually now voting for Republicans.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, your argument about kind of Jews and Israel, or that was also following a longtime Catholic argument, which no longer makes sense. And pollsters don't talk about it because being Catholic, it doesn't actually indicate how you're going to vote about anything. Even
but that
abortion,
was the assumption about John
Yeah.
Kennedy. That was the big attack on him. Was he going to be loyal to the Vatican, not the
Yeah.
United States?
About appearing on Fox, are there networks that part of I've read, part of your rationale for going on there is that you get to reach a large audience and people who are not necessarily familiar with your critique, even if you travel a certain distance with, a kind of right-wing, narrative these days. Are there places that you won't go on? Is there something that Fox News might do where you're like, okay, I'm done with that?
No, I mean, when look, I mean, I'm not going to say no. I mean,
Right.
if, actual neo-Nazis wearing swastikas and talking every day about how Jews should be returned to the gas chambers or slavery was
So you're back to Hannity.
right, or Bill
Yeah.
O'Reilly.
Yeah.
No, but in general, I honestly believe, when I released my first book in 2006 about the Bush-Cheney administration, the first place that I went to talk about the book was the ACLU. The second place was the Cato Institute. So I've always been this believer in finding ways that I've always thought that the right and the left have more common ground than they either of them are willing to admit. That one of the few valuable political projects where you can actually make progress in changing the society as opposed to just profiteering off your platform is to find ways to bring those sides together based on those common values. So it's always been an important project of mine. But in general, I think that if you go into journalism or politics, it's because you believe you have something to say, that if enough people are persuaded by it, it will change the society for the better. Otherwise, why do it? And so the idea that you have an opportunity to speak to 100,000 people or 4 million people and you would turn it down makes no sense to me. Why would you look for ways to minimize the audience that's hearing your views rather than if you're doing that, it's just self-indulgence. You don't really have a conviction about changing anything.
Are you a paid contributor for
No,
Fox
I've never
News?
been paid a penny by Fox or CNN or MSNBC or any cable network. And
Any reason for that other than they haven't
I
offered?
just,
or
no, I mean,
they
I've
know
never
you work for
pursued
free?
it. I think
Yeah.
it's better to keep my independence. I don't want to be paid by any of these places. My independence has always been the most valuable thing to me.